Muy bien, pues buen día a todas y a todos, profesoras, profesores, estudiantes y asistentes en general. A nombre de la doctora Anabel de la Rosa Gómez, responsable del Laboratorio de Psicología e Innovación Tecnológica de la Facultad de Estudios Superiores Iztacala de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, les doy la más cordial bienvenida. Nos encontramos en nuestra última sesión del seminario web Salud Mental, Evaluación e Intervenciones Emergentes. Está a cargo de la doctora Allison Harvey. Y bueno, quisiera agradecer a la maestra Alicia Flores, quien nos ha acompañado en estas 9 sesiones, a todo el equipo del laboratorio, a todas y a todos los asistentes, y en general a los ponentes, a las ponentes, a los moderadores que también nos han venido acompañando. Muchísimas gracias. Y quisiéramos agradecer el apoyo del Consejo Nacional de Ciencia y Tecnología México, CONACYT, convocatoria 2020-04, proyectos de innovación e incidencia social en salud mental y adicciones, subvención número 1401. Y asimismo invitarles a que estén atentos a las redes del laboratorio para los eventos del próximo año. Y bueno, Ali, si me lo permites, sin más, nuevamente agradecerte, agradecer la asistencia y si nos puedes ayudar a darle la bienvenida al doctor Esteban Esquivel Santoveña de la Universidad Autónoma de Ciudad Juárez, quien será quien modere esta conferencia, y a la doctora Allison Harvey, por favor. Welcome, Allison, and thank you for accepting the invitation. And bueno, pues bienvenidos y muchísimas gracias, Alice. Muchísimas gracias.
Un gusto. Que sea una buena jornada para todos hoy.
Sí, muy buenos días a todos. Gracias por la invitación. Esteban Esquivel, a la orden de la Universidad Autónoma de Ciudad Juárez. El día de hoy, pues nos hace el honor la doctora Harvey de acompañarnos con su presentación aprovechando la ciencia para crear y diseminar tratamientos transdiagnósticos noveles para mejorar la salud mental. Una forma de cerrar con, digamos, con broche de oro este seminario web. Sin afán de extenderme más, voy a leer una breve reseña de la doctora de su amplio currículum. La doctora Harvey es psicóloga clínica y directora de la Clínica y Centro de Investigación Golden Bear, especializado en comportamiento del sueño en el Departamento de Psicología de la Universidad de California, Berkeley. Obtuvo su doctorado y tiene experiencia clínica obtenida en Sydney, Australia, y un postdoctorado en la Universidad de Oxford, en el Departamento de Psiquiatría. Ella ha tenido experiencia en intervención bajo el enfoque cognitivo-conductual por más de 20 años y ha desarrollado estudios experimentales en intervenciones enfocadas a entender el sueño y los problemas circadianos, enfermedad mental severa y procesos de cambios de conducta. La doctora Harvey ha expandido sus áreas de interés hacia la ciencia de la diseminación e implementación de intervenciones y ha tenido el honor de participar en el Instituto de Capacitación de Estudios en Diseminación e Implementación en el área de salud, auspiciado por el Instituto Nacional del Cáncer en Estados Unidos. Ha publicado más de 250 artículos de investigación y capítulos de libro y ha publicado 3 libros. Los proyectos de su equipo de investigación están financiados por el Instituto Nacional de Salud Mental y el Instituto Nacional de Salud Infantil y Desarrollo Humano. La doctora Harvey ha recibido numerosos premios, incluyendo el de la Asociación Americana de Terapia Conductual. Fue conferido el doctorado honoris causa por la Universidad de Örebro en Suecia y es miembro de la Asociación de Ciencia Conductual y ha fungido en el Comité Ejecutivo de la Academia de Ciencia en Psicología Clínica y en el Comité Revisor para el Sistema de Acreditación de Psicología Clínica Científica. Es un amplio currículum el de la doctora. So, without further ado, We are very honored, Professor Harvey, to have you in our last session of the year of the webinar. And without, I don't want to extend myself more, so I'll leave the floor to you.
Gracias. Thank you. And buenos dias, everyone. Good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here. And the place I want to start this morning is to introduce some of the themes that I hope our discussion this morning can link to. So let me begin. This is the first theme. No surprise, probably here. A staggering 3 in 10 of us will meet diagnostic criteria for a psychological health problem in any 1 year. That's a staggering number. And these are not trivial problems. They're way up there with the leading causes of disability worldwide. Suicide, which is often, although not always, associated with a mental health problem, is a leading cause of death. And these studies, Murray and Voss, published in The Lancet, tell us that over the period from 1990 to 2010, there was an increase in the prevalence of psychological health problems. So clearly, our current approaches are not sufficient. I think part of the problem is that we've got a really big gap between science and practice. What I mean by that is there's data showing that only a small percentage of the treatment innovations that any of us will use, that any of us develop, will ever get used in routine practice. And even those innovations that do get used, there's a gap between that takes about 15 to 20 years from when the treatment was developed to when it comes into routine practice. So there's this really big gap between science and practice. Fortunately, there's a flourishing branch of our field called implementation science that is really trying to bridge this gap. And so this is one of the themes that I want to talk about today. Another theme that I want to talk about today is that this is an approach published in Clinical Psychological Science some years ago now that depicts an iterative and systematic process whereby basic science research can be used to generate a new intervention, and that we can go around different stages of research, sometimes skipping a stage. But the other thing I like about this is that it encourages us right from the beginning to be thinking about implementation and dissemination. So another theme I want to develop this morning is many of us have traditionally focused on just one specific psychological disorder. We might do research, say, in OCD, and run a clinic for clients who need treatments for OCD. Now, this has paid off for sure. This has helped us to understand something about the cause and maintenance of problems. And also, it's helped us to come up with more effective strategies for treating disorders. But I think many of us have become very interested in the commonalities across the disorders. And we call this the Transdagnostic Framework. And we think it would give us a bunch of advantages. The first advantage is that it might help us to explain and treat comorbidity. I'll be showing you data pretty soon on the rates of comorbidity for some of the problems that we've been working on. And I'm sure it's the same in your own work. But, you know, if we're just working on single disorders and single disorder treatments, it doesn't help us fully to help people who are experiencing more than one condition. And actually, that's the majority of people. Another advantage is that it might help us to make sure that breakthroughs made in one area more rapidly get transferred through to other areas and to break down silos between different areas. And a third advantage, and I hope I'll be able to demonstrate this today, is that it might help us to hasten the implementation, the dissemination, the availability of treatments in our field. So a fourth and final theme. One of the themes that I work on is sleep and circadian disturbances, and that's what I want to focus on in our discussion today. And I just want to note in this theme that psychological health problems are highly comorbid with various sleep and circadian problems, insomnia, hypersomnia, and you can see the other problems, and there are more, hence the etc. here. We've been interested for some time in sleep and circadian disturbances as likely transdiagnostic processes. So there are four themes. Now I want to move on and show how we've been thinking about these four themes. So first up, I want to turn to share some of the work we've been doing on bipolar disorder. Now, this is a single disorder. So this is back when we were working on single disorders. Now, we all know that bipolar disorder can be a very serious psychological health problem. And down the bottom here, we also know that sleep and circadian problems are very prominent correlates of episodes and inadequate recovery in bipolar disorder. And so when we came into this field, a number of colleagues were challenging us, and they said, look, the sleep and circadian piece in bipolar disorder is just an epiphenomenon. It's just a byproduct. But we persisted in our work because there are a number of scholars in the field that you can see listed here in this first bullet point, who really were showing in a very profound way the importance of sleep and circadian problems. And then there were other colleagues showing that sleep disturbance is the most common prodrome or early warning signal of mania, and the sixth most common prodrome or early warning signal of depression. Then we have a lot of daily diary studies, including some from my team here, showing that sleep loss is highly correlated with daily manic symptoms and negative affect. In other words, sleep at night and affect in the day are really tightly coupled. And there are just a few sleep deprivation studies showing that sleep deprivation can trigger hypermania or mania in a proportion of patients. So I think we can consider this bidirectional escalating vicious cycle whereby sleep and circadian disturbance at night contributes to mood regulation difficulty in the day, and mood regulation difficulty in the day makes it difficult to get to sleep and to stay asleep at night. And that this escalating cycle between poor nighttime sleep and daytime mood dysregulation might be one part of the multifactorial causation of inter-episode dysfunction, which we know can be a real problem for people with bipolar disorder. And it might also create a vulnerability to relapse for people with bipolar disorder. So in deciding what to bring along to present to you today in terms of our work on bipolar disorder, I decided to bring along the work that pushed our thinking in new ways, that completely surprised us at the time. So the first finding comes from the Big Step BD study. This is a multi-site study that recruited over 2,000 people diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And the first surprise from this study, maybe it shouldn't have been a surprise, but it was a surprise at the time, was the variability in sleep and wake times across 1 week is about 3 hours. So consider that. Consider your favorite place to fly to. That's a 3-hour time zone difference away. So, you know, I'm over here in California, and over Thanksgiving holiday, which we've just had, I flew over to New Jersey to see some family there. That's a 3-hour time difference. Now, I just did that. I guess I was there for 5 days, and it completely knocked out my sleep, my eating patterns, all of my routines. And I only did it once. I cannot imagine doing this on a weekly basis. But the evidence is that there are people with bipolar disorder who are doing this on a weekly basis. So right here is a clinical implication that I'll loop back to in time of regularizing bedtimes and wake-up times. I'll say more about that in a moment. But what we want to be doing is switching out this social jet lag that many people, particularly people with bipolar disorder, are living in. Here's a second finding that really surprised us. Again, it probably shouldn't have surprised us. Maybe you already know this. But in bipolar disorder, there are certainly a lot of normal sleepers. And we knew that there were a lot of short sleepers. That was not a surprise. Now, if you compare the mood of short sleepers with normal sleepers, just cross-sectionally, you can see that there's more depression, 25% here, 40% here, and more elevation here compared to here. Here's the surprise. We didn't know that there were so many long sleepers here. And long sleep is not good. There's more depression here. So we began to be very interested in long sleepers. And Kate Kaplan went and took a look at our archives of people who were into episode for bipolar disorder in our archives, and she found a rate of about 25%. So that's a good chunk of people with bipolar disorder. We really need to be thinking about something that's affecting 25% of people with bipolar disorder. And then when Kate went into the data to take a look, and she compared total sleep time with time in bed, she actually developed the hypothesis that there's sometimes a problem of too much time in bed. It's not so much a problem of too much total sleep time. So it's not classic hypersomnia. It's more a behavioral problem of maybe not having anything to get up for and spending too much time in bed or feeling depressed and finding it hard to get out of bed. So this is a program of research that continues and I think is very important. But all of this is much more complicated than we expected. We came into this program of research really expecting to work on insomnia. And actually, we're finding hypersomnia, or maybe it's too much time in bed. There are certainly short sleepers. There are many people with irregular bed and wake times, and much, much more. So about this time that we realized all of the complexity, we received a grant that was to deliver cognitive behavior therapy for insomnia to people with bipolar disorder. And so we thought, wow, but if we only treat the insomnia, we're not going to be serving the fuller group of sleep problems that people with bipolar disorder are experiencing. So we decided to do some adaptations to CBTI. And then we tested this adapted version of CBTI with people who have bipolar disorder and sleep problems. And we really thought of this treatment study, this pilot treatment study of this new treatment or the adapted CBTI treatment as a treatment experiment. We're trying to cut into the sleep disturbance here, cut it out, put a big cross on it, cut into this vicious cycle, and maybe make a difference for inter-episode dysfunction and vulnerability for relapse. So here's the design of the study. We randomized people with bipolar disorder and insomnia. First of all, everyone was being treated by a psychiatrist and were receiving mood-stabilizing medications. But half of the sample also received cognitive behavior therapy for insomnia, adapted for bipolar disorder, and half received psychoeducation. And we followed people up at 6 months. And we had very interesting results. On our main outcome variable, the Insomnia Severity Index, you can see in the red the group who got the adapted CBTI treatment, and there was an improvement from baseline through to post-treatment and on through to 6-month follow-up. And actually the psychoeducation group improved too, but just not as much as the CBTI adapted for bipolar disorder group. So this is very encouraging. And actually the two groups looked really both good on general impairment after receiving these treatments. And I think this is good news because psychoeducation does help people, but it doesn't help people as much as the CBTI adapted for bipolar disorder when we look at relapse. In the red, you can see the group who got the adapted CBTI treatment, and they're experiencing less depression, mania, and that's just combining the two different types of reoccurrence. And in the blue, we've got the psychoeducation, so they are relapsing at higher rates. So this is very interesting. It looks like an adapted version of cognitive behavior therapy for insomnia is helping with relapse. Now, a key observation in the field that I want to point out at this point, and you may be aware of, is I just showed you data in bipolar disorder that sleep and circadian interventions improve sleep and symptoms of the comorbid disorder. But I could show you almost the same pattern of results for a couple of different studies published in the literature for different disorders. And so, as you'll see, most of these studies that I've just shown you a list of here are actually disorder focused. They're focused on insomnia. But I'm concerned that real-life sleep and circadian problems are not so easily categorized, and that there are often clinical or subclinical features of hypersomnia, delayed phase, irregular sleep and wake times, and so on and so forth. So I'll say more about that and present more evidence for that soon. But then the question I think becomes, how do we deal with all of this complexity in terms of developing new treatments? Do we continue to develop multiple disorder-focused treatments like we just did? I just presented cognitive behavior therapy adapted for bipolar disorder. Well, considering empirically supported treatments broadly for a moment, not just sleep and circadian, think about all the empirically supported treatments we have. We've actually got hundreds of them. It's a good problem in many ways. It's called the too many empirically supported treatments problem, but it does place an immense burden on clinicians in routine practice settings who have to learn multiple disorder-focused protocols with common theoretical underpinnings. And ultimately, this can make it really difficult for the patients who need the treatments to get them. So I might also say, not just make it difficult for the clinicians and the patients, but I think often sleep and circadian problems are just lost in all of the complexity. So we decided to see what would happen if we could develop one treatment that might be helpful across various sleep and circadian disturbances, so insomnia, hypersomnia, delayed sleep phase, and so on, and across psychological disorders, So it might be helpful for bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, depression, anxiety. And I'll be showing you data in a moment that it is helpful in both teenagers and in adults. Now, if this is possible to do this, it would confer an advantage for dissemination, because we'd only be training providers in one treatment that covers multiple problems. And this is particularly important in low-resource routine practice settings, like some of the settings we're working in. And this first treatment is called the Transdagnostic Intervention for Sleep and Circadian Dysfunction. So let me talk more about TransC. We're a treatment development team, and when we develop new treatments, we take seriously the task of using rigor and science as the basis of the treatment development process. So let me give you a taster of the sources for developing TransC. So the first source was the basic sleep and circadian science here. And so, you know, as I've said, there's all of this complexity in terms of sleep and circadian functioning that's very common. So what is all this complexity doing at the level of the biological clocks? Well, this is beautiful science. If you don't know this science, I'm excited to share it with you. There are actually clocks in every cell and organ in these bodies of ours. There's the central clock, the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain. It controls the circadian system, and it is so sensitive to light and dark. So there's a treatment implication right there. If you want to sleep better, we need dim lights before bedtime and bright lights in the morning. Then there are clocks in every other cell and organ, but they synchronize to a variety of stimuli, not just light and dark, and they synchronize at their own rates, but they interact with all of the other clocks. So under conditions where there's irregular bed and wake up times, the orchestra of biological clocks is in tune. Our bodies are playing beautiful music. That's why I've got a picture here of a conductor. But here's what happens under conditions of irregular bed and wake times, of exposures to light and dark that are not appropriate for humans. We get double desynchronization, and what that means is that the clocks internally and externally are out of sync, and within the body, the clocks are out of sync with each other. Oh, and I just want to say, in the transdiagnostic treatment for sleep and circadian problems, there are approaches there to help people to develop habits that will hopefully last a lifetime of regular bedtimes and regular wake-ups times. Excuse me. One other piece of the sleep and circadian science. This is Bowlby's classic, very famous, most important two-process model that explains how and when we get our sleep. And it articulates two separate systems, the sleep system, or process S, and the circadian system, or process C. And this is a diagram of how they interact. I'm not going to go into the details. It would take too long. It's super interesting, though. So we don't know the specific contribution of these two systems to the sleep problems experienced by people with psychological health problems. But what we do know is that these systems are preferentially open. In other words, evolution has endowed these systems to be preferentially open to certain exogenous inputs. So if you manipulate these things, it's going to have a big impact on sleep. This has been shown in animal studies, in human studies. These are powerful exogenous inputs to the circadian system. And if you take a look at them, they're modifiable with the kind of behavior change interventions that we all know how to do. So in the transdiagnostic treatment, that's exactly what we aim to do. We aim to target these exogenous inputs to the circadian system and modify them to bring about better sleep. So as you can also see, another source for the transdiagnostic treatment are current evidence-based treatments. We drew themes from each of these. And one of the treatments is cognitive behavior therapy for insomnia. And because it's such an important treatment for insomnia, I want to give you a little taster of it. So just a glimpse. The recommendation within one of the subparts of cognitive behavior therapy for insomnia is to go to bed only when sleepy. And the responsibility of us as the therapists is to help people to develop habits that will help them to get sleepy at an appropriate time of the day. Another recommendation within this treatment is to awaken about the same time every morning, because it's the anchor around which everything else aligns. And that, in some ways, is the most important take-home message from my talk today, that if you put in that anchor and awaken about the same time every morning, it really helps to reorganize the circadian system. Another recommendation from this treatment is to use the bed mainly for sleeping so that we don't get maladaptive conditioning or a learned association between wakefulness and the bedroom. So we drew on CBTI as well as chronotherapy, as well as interpersonal and social rhythms therapy. I won't go into all of them today. Of course, it would take a whole day. But let me move on now to show you the actual transdiagnostic treatment. As you can see, it's a modular treatment. There are cross-cutting modules that you'll be very familiar with. They're common in most evidence-based psychological treatments. Then there are the core modules that are the basic building blocks of sleep health for everybody. Then there are the optional modules that we bring in depending on the specific challenges that each person is experiencing. So now, excuse me, a test of this treatment. We did this first test of the transdiagnostic treatment with youth who are night owls. And we had big, wide open inclusion gates. So we included everyone we could with all of the complexities. And here's why we chose evening chronotype. In the literature, there's a lot of evidence that being an evening chronotype young person is associated with a whole lot of different psychological health problems. So we wondered, would we reduce risk associated with eveningness if we can reduce eveningness? So here's the design of the study. People were 10 to 18 years old. There were 176 young people, and they either got the transdiagnostic treatment or they got psychoeducation. And notice that psychoeducation over here in the green border is a pretty strong control condition. And actually both treatments improved on this primary outcome measure. In this side, we've got psychoeducation, and this side, we've got the transdiagnostic treatment. In the blue, before the treatment, you see that people are doing better in the orange. That's after the treatment. But people who got the transdiagnostic treatment did significantly better. This outcome was maintained through 12-month follow-up. This was actually not true for daytime sleepiness. For daytime sleepiness, it was only the transdiagnostic treatment that improved. And that finding was maintained to 6 months, but not 12-month follow-up. The reason I'm including the follow-ups is, as you'll see in a moment, we're very interested in what happens after we stop a dose of treatment. How long does the treatment last? I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, we're very interested in reducing the discrepancy between weekdays and weekends, the so-called social jet lag. And we did manage to do that in this study in terms of wait time. So that is good news. We also took dim light melatonin onset in the lab. And you can see there was a significant interaction. And it looks like for psychoeducation, there was a tendency for there to be a delay in dim light melatonin onset from before to after the treatment. Whereas for the transdiagnostic treatment, there was an advance in dim light melatonin. So this again is very good news. It looks like the transdiagnostic treatment is very helpful to people. Now, as I said, we're interested in, do people actually keep doing these treatments 6 and 12-month follow-up? And actually, they do. These are the top 3 sleep health behaviors people are still using. And though that's the good news, the bad news is they only use them on average occasionally. So this has really led our team here at UC Berkeley to start to think about the science of habit formation in the context of evidence-based psychological treatments. And that's our current work, really focusing in that domain. So at this point, I've spoken about that study was an efficacy study done in a research context. And I want to speak briefly as we start to move toward the end about as we move toward dissemination and implementation, our work out in the community. We decided to move an arm of our work out into a community settings because we were very concerned about the representativeness of the samples we we recruit when we do the research in the context of our university setting. Here in the Bay Area, we live in a very diverse region, but it was mainly white people who came into our studies. And we wanted to work out, who is not comfortable attending a university clinic for treatment and what are the barriers. And so we thought, well, it's really hard to get people in, so let's go out to people. And so we started to partner with a group of community mental health centers. Now, up here in the United States of America, you probably know that the healthcare system is really mind-blowingly problematic. There's many people who don't have insurance, any kind of health insurance. I think it's 26 million Americans at this point. So community mental health centers are a location, one of the few locations people can go to get treatments. But these are very under-resourced locations. The providers are truly amazing. They carry, though, a heavy, complex, and comorbid caseload, and they may not receive training or supervision in evidence-based psychological treatments. And so this is the first study we conducted in the San Francisco Bay Area. And now we've got, excuse me, a larger one going on that I won't talk about today. Maybe I'll come back in a year or two to describe that. But now we are working with a more diverse sample, and about 50% of our sample met diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia, and comorbidity was very common, as you'll see in a moment. And here's the main question we wanted to ask. For individuals who have a mental disorder, who have been diagnosed with a mental disorder treated in a community mental health care setting, does the transdiagnostic treatment improve these outcomes? And let's have a look at the outcomes. This is sleep. In the red is the transdiagnostic treatment, and in the blue are the group who were getting usual care. And you can see for sleep disturbance, there was a reduction in sleep disturbance from before to after the treatment, and this was maintained to 6-month follow-up. Now, interestingly, this is a measure of psychiatric symptoms. Now, everyone was receiving usual care. So that was typically medications from a psychiatrist. And when you add a sleep treatment to those medications, you see this improvement in psychiatric symptoms. In other words, treating sleep problems will improve delusions, hallucinations, mania, depression, and anxiety. And that's exactly what we saw too on the PSI-RATS, a measure of psychotic symptoms and some other outcomes. And just to sort of say that in this study, the amount of comorbidity was really staggering. Only 10% of people met criteria for only one sleep or circadian problem. And on top of that, 80% met criteria for at least one subsyndromal diagnosis. So, you know, we thought, what if we look at a specific disorder like schizophrenia? Maybe it will be a clearer, simpler pattern, but it wasn't. There were 39 distinct sleep and circadian, full and subsyndromal diagnostic combinations. So this really adds to the growing evidence of the massive heterogeneity within diagnoses, and I think points to the need for transdiagnostic treatments to match the complexity of the experiences that people are having. So a brief summary, and then I want to do something else in just a moment. I've argued that working transdiagnostically can be very helpful for at least some of us to be doing that work. I think myself that disorder-focused treatments is still worthwhile to do. And, you know, they have a place, as does disorder-focused research, but some of us at least working transdiagnostically. And I hope I've been able to convince you that it might be possible to generate simple, short, powerful, and inexpensive transdiagnostic approaches, which potential for wide-ranging public health impact. And that this might have advantages, particularly for low-resource settings. And just finally, to put out the warning that in at least some contexts, there's going to be a mismatch between the comorbidity and complexity of the problems people are experiencing and the treatments available. And just to finish with this, I think real value in conducting research within practice settings. I like this quote: if we want more evidence-based practice, we need more practice-based evidence. And also this quote, I think we believe that if we build it, they will come. And actually, that's just not the case. And, you know, just in finishing off, I sense that the group here today are mental health professionals. And I just wanted to put out very briefly some of the sleep tips and tricks that I think are super important when working with clients, and also for your own sleep. Being a provider of mental health treatments and doing research in this area, I know that's another group represented today, is hard. And we need to be sleeping well in order to do the work. So let me say, first of all, keeping a sleep diary, a daily sleep diary, just paper and pencil is fine, is super helpful. And then we're always looking for 8+ tweaks. We're never looking for like the one thing that's going to improve our sleep. And I think often, and particularly, we're all moving through the age range, whether we like it or not, and our metabolism does change. And we may not be able to manage as much caffeine and as much alcohol, and we may have to cut our levels down. Certainly dimming those lights and getting the romantic lighting going before bedtime. I've emphasized regular bedtimes and, most important of all, regular wake-up times and bright light in the morning. And if you can't get to sleep after 15 or 20 minutes without checking the clock, no clock checking. We've done some experiments in behavior research and therapy, published one of them, showing that clock checking actually increases anxiety and makes it more difficult for people to sleep. Light pollution is a huge problem. You know, all of the different little red and green lights on the heater, the air conditioner, the devices, put duct tape over them. They're causing light pollution. Make sure the bedroom's very dark so that the morning light doesn't wake us up. And we want to increase exercise. This is the one thing that can really build homeostatic pressure to sleep, but not too close to bedtime. And with all of these changes, we've got to consider the time frame. If we do them just once, it's not going to fundamentally change. We've got to build up over a period of 2 to 3 to 4 weeks, develop these as new habits over 3 to 4 weeks. And there is some research that us humans are often not aware that we actually get more sleep than we think we're getting. So keep that in mind too. And finally, of course, a poor night of sleep will happen. Those of us who have been parents will remember that first year in our children's lives where they just don't sleep. Babies' brains are not developed. The suprachiasmatic nucleus is not fully developed until about 6 months. So we can be nudging them toward good sleep, but we need to be feeding them at regular intervals across the night, and we get through. We accept that the poor night of sleep will happen. And finally, just to watch the vicious racing cycles in our minds. You know, it's so easy when we're not sleeping to think, I'm never going to get back to sleep. I won't cope tomorrow. I'm going to get sick. And, you know, the possibility of reassociating those periods with gratitude practice, like, it's so nice and comfy to be here, or it feels so warm and so calm. And of course, these monkey minds that we have will dash back off onto the worry and rumination, but to very gently bring it back again. And of course, these are very initial tips. Cognitive therapy is so helpful for worry and rumination and is much more detailed, and I highly recommend it. And then finally, to thank the wonderful people I get to work with every day. And please stay in touch. I'm on Twitter. Would love to stay in touch with you. And I think we've got time for some questions now. So thank you very much, everyone. I'll go in here and see if I can find the questions.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Harvey, for this very interesting talk. We have a few questions. I have a couple of questions myself. So first, I'd like to ask you if in the TransC study, if there were any sort of provisions or, you know, or anything, you know, just thoughts taking in consideration the COVID pandemic. How did you carry out the study considering those? Were there any barriers?
Yeah, great question. Thank you so much. So the studies that I presented today were conducted just before the pandemic, but the studies that we've been conducting during the pandemic, we did move them online, and it has been very successful doing them online, you know, via Zoom. We're still able to screen share the sleep diaries, etc. And, you know, obviously sleep became even more problematic during the pandemic. And so we did find ourselves adding components to be helpful to people during that time. And I think long COVID is a place where we're starting to see a lot of sleep problems. And we're not working on long COVID ourselves, but I think there's a great need for maybe people here in the audience to be doing sleep research and circadian research with long COVID. So I think the whole COVID sleep and circadian set of questions is really important. Thank you for raising it.
Mm-hmm. So we got a question here from Sandra Cerezo Resendiz. She's asking, how did the pandemic affect the quality of sleep and circadian cycle, say your participants?
Yeah, that one's an interesting one. I have seen evidence that when the kids were at home, they were actually getting more sleep. They were able to sleep more on their natural sleep cycle rather than having to get up, get on the school bus and get to school. So there was some evidence that youth were getting a little bit more sleep. But I think for many adults and some youth too, there was just a lot of anxiety and a lot of social isolation. And these are not conditions under which we sleep well. And the rates of sleep and circadian problems during the pandemic just skyrocketed. And certainly our clinic was inundated with the need for treatment. And it makes sense, right? Because when animals go to sleep, they go to safe burrows and safe nests. And we need that too. And we didn't feel that during the pandemic. And so I think part of the intervention at that time was, how can we help people in their own social environments, isolated or with too many people and can't get away from them, but isolated in a different way, how to help each of those people feel safe enough to be able to get off to sleep and stay asleep. And the research is continuing to come out. So I think we'll see more on that topic.
Okay. And so Alejandra Mares Portillo is asking how long must a person have spent insomnia to be diagnosed with sleep and circadian disturbance?
Yeah, so the diagnostic criteria for insomnia in the DSM-5, I believe, says for 3 months. And, it's a pretty arbitrary time frame though, right? Sometimes people will seek treatment after a month. And actually, maybe in some ways, problems are a little bit easier to treat if you get them earlier. So, the diagnostic criteria do specify these timeframes, but I would encourage not sticking to them too strictly in terms of providing the treatments, because early intervention might actually be kind of more helpful before the problems become really entrenched.
And one final question. I want to go back to my original question, because of a focus of a lab here in Mexico with the project and the seminar, and the interest in carrying out, interventions that can be reached by many people, particularly using the telepsychology modality. Is this something that in the TransC study, is this something you and your team is looking at in terms of, let's say, testing the efficacy of a normal intervention, a standard intervention, let's say, people walking in to the clinic versus an intervention probably combining a person, psychotherapist, looking at the patient in combination with some applications developed for the patients?
Oh, that's really interesting. The apps for delivering treatment, I think, are a really wonderful and interesting way. And I'm so glad it sounds like you're pursuing that. We're not pursuing that at this stage. We've been so busy with other things, and we're so glad that people are pursuing that. And I think it has great potential. It's so much more accessible to people, and, making it engaging is a challenge, of course, but when it comes to sleep and circadian problems, I think that people are very interested. Like, you know, you can get people interested so easily just by having conversations about, you know, this is where we do our dreaming sleep. You know, stage 3 and 4 sleep are important for growth and repair. So I think it's inherently a bit more engaging than many topics for apps. But I think that there's a wonderful possibility there. And I think that the transdiagnostic approach could really be applied in an app sort of situation, just kind of maybe starting with the core modules and then moving on to the optional modules, you know. Yeah, it's a great idea.
Thank you. It's very interesting what you are doing, what you guys are doing there. And well, I think we don't have any other questions so far. So I would like to thank you for sharing your insights, your experience with us today. And I'm gonna leave the mic to Lorena. So she wants to do some closing remarks.
Well, thank you, Allison, and congratulations for your conference. Thank you. And bueno, quiero aprovechar este cierre para nuevamente agradecer al doctor Esteban Esquivel por la moderación, y aprovecho también este cierre para agradecer con quienes hemos colaborado a lo largo de este seminario, gracias al Grupo Comunidad de Habilidades y Aprendizaje con Tecnologías Chat, a la Universidad Autónoma de Ciudad Juárez, al Instituto Tecnológico de Sonora, a la Universidad Autónoma de Baja California, a la Facultad de Psicología, a la Secretaría de Salud de Tlaxcala y, por supuesto, a la Facultad de Estudios Superiores Iztacala y a la universidad. Muchísimas gracias. Y bueno, pues, maestra Alicia Flores, te cedo la palabra antes de irnos. Muchísimas gracias nuevamente y adelante.
Agradecemos a todas y todos los asistentes a este seminario y les recordamos que si hicieron su registro y estuvieron participando en los foros, antes de que termine el año, se les hará llegar su constancia vía correo. Muchísimas gracias a todas y a todos. Que tengan un excelente inicio de semana.
Hasta luego.